Right, so what I wanted to talk to you about today is an idea that I think is very important for the strategy that we at Garvan want to apply to deciding where to invest our resources over the next 5 to 10 years. In essence, there are two principles. The first principle is try to make people the center of your research program. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds in cancer research. Over the past 100 years, most of what we've learned about cancer biology has come from taking very simple model systems like viruses or mice or flies and studying very simple systems to understand some of the fundamental principles that drive cell growth, the fundamental biology of cancer. But I think we've moved into an era, thanks to genomic technologies, where we can finally tackle the human problem directly. And of course, that's wonderfully exciting in terms of those of us who want to see an impact upon health outcomes for our patients. But it also creates an enormous opportunity for centres like the Kinghorn Cancer Centre, which sees patients on the first 2 floors and has a research laboratory stacked above that. I want to find ways of bringing those things together. So rare and neglected cancers are interesting in particular because they have typically been, as I will show you, neglected. They are an area where, if you like, angels fear to tread. And I think the remit of any research division is not to tackle the esoteric and the minor, paradoxically, but rather to tackle things that could make a huge difference at the population level. And I think this, ironically as it sounds, with a title, with words like rare in the title, but I think that's the case for these sets of diseases. And I think the time is right, as I hope to persuade you by the end of my talk. So let me start off by describing the problem of rare and neglected diseases and giving you an impression about the sheer impact at the population level. So it's sufficiently important a problem that the National Institutes of Health in the US, probably the largest organization focused on health globally, has an office for rare diseases. And in the US, that's defined as any disease which has less than 200,000 cases in the US at any one time, with a prevalence of about 5 in 10,000 in the community. The Europeans have also established an office for an organization for rare diseases. They have a slightly different definition, but things that affect between less than 6 to 8% of the population. In terms of cancer, the Europeans' working group definition of very rare diseases is a crude incidence rate of about less than 2 per 100,000 for both sexes combined. Rare diseases, as opposed to very rare, there are definitions for all these terms, but I think these are the general principles, is less than 6 per 100,000, and less common cancers, in aggregate, less than 12 per 100,000. So in cancer, those definitions encompass 186 different cancer diagnoses. What about the impact socially? So this is an Australian data, and I'll take you through the table slowly. You can see here in Australia the number of new cases of each cancer type that we deal with typically, for example, prostate cancer, ordered in order of decreasing frequency. So 15,000 odd prostate cancer diagnosed each year, about 13,000 bowel cancers, 12,000 breast cancers, and so forth, down to the 10th in this list, which is leukemia, with 2,600 cases. The column next to the right of that is deaths. So of course you can have a disease which has a high incidence, but is actually relatively easily cured. And for example, if you look at prostate cancer, although there's 15,800 diagnoses, there are less than 3,000 deaths. Whereas for lung cancer, there's almost 3 times that number of deaths because it's a highly lethal condition. And then there's a third way of measuring the impact on the community, and that's this term, potential years of life lost. And that reflects the age at which these diagnoses are made. Obviously, a disease which is diagnosed typically very late in life may have a lesser impact in terms of years of life lost than a disease which affects 20-year-olds. And it depends again upon the lethality as well. So my point here is, Each year in Australia, there are about 100,000 cancer diagnoses. That's increased since this data I pulled this data out to about 125,000, with about 38,000 to 40,000 deaths and about 500,000 years of life lost to our community. So the question I want to put to you now is, if we took rare and neglected cancers, what would that look like on this scale? All the things that we typically don't hear about or know about. There are 25,000 new diagnoses of rare and neglected cancers. They constitute 12,000, almost 13,000 deaths each year, or about a third of all deaths in this country. And they constitute the single largest, by threefold almost, 1.5-fold over lung cancer, years of life lost to our community. And they have been systematically neglected. I'll show you some evidence for that. They're the people that we've left behind. In numbers, if you take the super rare diagnostic category I mentioned earlier, at 1 in 100,000, that is 2,200 Australian deaths per year, or about 5%. For rare, it's 14,000 deaths, Australian deaths each year. This is my patient. She doesn't care a rat's what the diagnosis is, or whether I think it's fascinating and rare. She is fighting for her life. So that's the human face of these numbers. So it's interesting to look at the impact of rare and common cancers. And what you see in this table is the impact over the past 20 years of the ratio of incidence to mortality. The higher the mortality for incidence, the more lethal the cancer. And what you see is, for common cancers, over the past 20 years, these are the ones in blue, the ratio of mortality, the number of people who die, who get diagnosed, has been decreasing over that time by about a third. Massive impact, which demonstrates the impact of research on outcomes, I believe. This is what happens when you don't do research into these diseases. The mortality to incidence ratio has actually been rising. In fact, if you look at children, because these things affect younger population, that's why the years of life lost are so high, disproportionately high for these diseases. Rare and less common cancers are the single greatest cause of death of children in our community, above traffic incidents, for example, or accidental drownings. If you look at the Generation Y, 20 to 39-year-olds, amongst all cancer deaths, you can see over 2/3 are due to rare and less common cancers. For young people, suicide and traffic accidents and drug overdoses and alcohol are the leading cause of death, but then it's rare and less common cancers. It's interesting what words do to the way that we think about a problem. We hear the term rare and we think it doesn't matter. It's too small, it's in the too hard basket. I've said that research is behind all this. That is the lack of research. Because research and evidence drives clinical practice and the investments we as a society make in the problems that we face. This table is complicated, so I'll take you through it carefully. It shows the relationship between the amount of money we put into research and the total burden of for cancer for that particular disease and the percentage of deaths. So you can see, for example, about 15% of research investment is put into blood cancers, which amount to about 10% of burden of disease or 10% of deaths. For breast cancer, about 22%. Breast cancer has been extraordinarily successful in lobbying as an area of importance to our community and has remarkable achievements in terms of raising funds, which partly account for the improvements in survival in this very important disease. But you can see the percentage of deaths here is about 7% of deaths and about 22% of funding. You go through this list and then you come to let's go to the last one. The last one here is the percentage of research investment in our community, somewhat around 2% compared to 15% of deaths in our community. This is an independent piece of data, and I'll take you through it slowly. Essentially, what it shows is the total investment in Victoria in 2005, according to Tumour Streams. About $200 million was invested in total. About $19 million was put into prostate cancer, essentially under this genitourinary category. Over here, you see the mortality due to those diseases. So the point I want you to make, I want you to derive from this is, these are the amounts of dollars we put in, and this is the impact upon survival. 4.3% mortality from prostate cancer, about $20 million of investment, or about 10% of total investment. This is the rare and neglected cancers category. It causes 21% of cancer deaths. It gets 0.5% of research funding. Right now, that translates into the way in which we invest in drugs. So this is a slightly different set of criteria for the definition of rare diseases. So in this definition, these rare diseases account for 1 in 2 deaths in our community. They receive 13.5% of research funding, so a disproportion of about 3-fold. And as a consequence, the number of drugs that we have that make difference to people's lives is 12.6%. Remember my patient, she's paid her taxes, she's dying from a rare disease. She has essentially 1/3 of what somebody with a common cancer would expect to receive in terms of opportunity to get reimbursed funding for drugs. All of which is a tragedy, but isn't necessarily an issue for a research organization if I take a cold-blooded look at this. Because a problem is only something that one should respond to if we can do something. I don't think going around in circles in what I call Brownian motion is productive in any way whatsoever. But I believe that we're at a time now where these diseases finally might be soluble, and I'll show you why. The sorts of machines that the Garvan has acquired, the Illumina X10, the Southern Hemisphere's only population-level whole genome sequencing facility, can deconvolute cancer, which is fundamentally a genetic disease. And what that means in practice is we can move through the 3 eras of the classifications of cancer much more quickly than we've ever been able to before. The first era is about anatomy. So the breast has a cancer in it, the surgeon tackles a breast. For hundreds and hundreds of years, that's how we've tackled breast cancer, and we've saved people's lives, and we continue to save people's lives by that approach. And then in the 1850s, the great German pathologist looked down the microscope for the first time and saw patterns. So breast cancer became ductal breast cancer or lobular breast cancer. And then over the past 30 years, we've taken a molecular classification. And that's the era in which we stand today. That is to say, breast cancer has become a breast cancer that has a mutation in the gene HER2 or overexpression of the estrogen receptor, or has a BRCA1 mutation, all of which have implications for the choice of treatments. That means, ironically, common diseases that we fund as an entity like breast cancer are actually lots of very small diseases. And there are some diseases that are quite rare, like osteosarcoma, which are showing characteristics that overlap with completely unrelated diseases, so we thought, 20 years ago, like breast cancer. For example, gastric cancer and pancreas cancer both share the amplification in a subset of cases of this gene for which there is an effective drug for breast cancer. And it works in gastric cancer and it works in pancreatic cancer, but it is not reimbursed for pancreatic cancer yet. That's a challenge. That's not about discovering the secrets behind cancer development. That's about us getting off our backsides as a community and making sure that we don't leave people behind of rare diseases. But it means that the problem is technically soluble, which I think is a really important challenge moving forward. And that's driven this idea of personalized medicine, that we get a particular diagnosis of the molecular nature using genomic technologies, we individualize the profile of the cancer changes, and then we deliver appropriate targeted therapies. And right now, over the past 5 years, I've seen personally people who go from this highly metastatic, highly malignant disease into one in which the drug has simply turned off the tumor, at least for periods of time. So that principle has been established. The principle exists. Whether we translate that into practice is the challenge. And the reality is that in parallel with all this enormous capacity to reclassify and diagnose cancers in a way that is useful to patients, we understand the switches we can turn off. The switches that we can turn off are increasing. The drugs for rare diseases are increasing, such that in Mark Caulfield, who heads up the massive enterprise of 100,000 genomes called Genome England, he reckons by the year 2020, there will be 200 drugs, new therapies for rare diseases that we could bring to the market if we just focused upon them. But one of the problems is clinical trials. The way we've conducted clinical trials has done yeoman service for 30 years and has brought these changes in breast cancer and bowel cancer and lung cancer, has improved those, shown that mortality to incidence ratio has improved. But as our research has expanded our clinical ability to translate faced challenges. So in the 1980s, a protocol to do a clinical trial took 10 pages to introduce a new drug. It took weeks to develop it. The cost per patient was under $3,000 per patient, and the time from submission to opening was a dizzying 2 weeks. The consent form was a short 3 pages. Now, the protocol is 150 pages. Development time takes years these people don't have to wait. The time from submission to opening takes 20 months. Somebody did a map of all the steps. There are 370 separate pre-activation steps to opening a trial. The consent form sometimes reaches 30 pages, and the cost per patient is over $120,000. So we have this exponential explosion in knowledge and a paradoxical decrease, a sort of bureaucratization of our ability to translate, sometimes for good reasons. What this means is the average phase 2 study, that is the proof of effect in patient populations, costs $10 million per study for 35 odd 40 patients, and the average phase 3 study costs $40 million. And the worst thing about it all is there's such a high failure rate that it costs in total for each drug $1 billion to go from the compound all the way through to something that's approved to go through the PBS into patients that we treat. So the challenge we face for rare diseases is with 186 cancers, how can we possibly conduct trials of this kind? It becomes impossible. If you have a breast cancer trial, it costs $10 to $40 million. You do that. But if you have 186 diseases, can we afford 186 times $50 million, $186 billion of investment total to find the drugs that we need? And that's going to be a challenge. And that's where the Garvan kicks in. Because it's up to people like me and my colleagues in the clinical arena to find ways of taking the brilliant basic research that's been conducted in the Garvan to identify these targets and the new drugs and actually find ways to get them into our patients. And we're going to do that by focusing on rare diseases. This just emphasizes the point. The net effect is, while we've got an explosion in knowledge, we have the cost of drug development has doubled every 9 years for the past half century and doesn't show any sign of slowing down. People like Hagop Kantarjan, a giant in hematology, for the past 40 years have written articles about the enormous challenges and the cost to our community in delivering this sort of thing. If we can find a way of making it cheaper, it makes it easier for communities to fund these drugs once we do get the breakthroughs. So the solutions that are being developed are so-called basket trials, where we target with one drug potentially many diseases. That's the problem, is that each drug treats only a small fraction of each disease. Or these things that we call umbrella trials, which use multiple drugs and treat multiple different types of patients in the one study. There has not been in this country, to my knowledge, an umbrella trial developed to this point until about 3 weeks ago, when St. Vincent's Human Research Ethics Committee approved the study that we have developed called the MOST program, the Molecular Screening and Therapeutics Program. This is the first of its kind, as I said, in the country, and the idea is that patients with rare and neglected diseases, no matter what they are, can get access to the state-of-the-art genomic screenings to identify the targets that we can use for treatment. We're not discriminating because they don't happen to have breast cancer or bowel cancer or lung cancer, because those trials exist for those patients already. We're going for everybody who's left behind and offering them access to this technology. And then we're linking that to a variety of treatments that are matched to those, personalizing their treatment. Because we don't believe in just handing out these things like confetti or like sugar babies. These drugs we need to know that they actually work. We're not absolved of the requirement to demonstrate evidence of efficacy. That's what we've got to do. So by conducting these, what we call signal-seeking studies in 16 odd patients with the criteria that gets them into this, we can test them with these new drugs, which we hope will make a huge difference. This means that rather than my patient in that photograph having to guess according to my best abilities to extract the drugs in an ad hoc way for her, or to crowd surf to raise the $70,000 required to get treatment, that she might be able to get access to this for free, as appropriate in the context of a clinical trial. This is the vision of the Kinghorn Cancer Centre in the rare and neglected cancer space. It's a way not just of talking about it, but actually materializing the opportunities and potentials of science to impact upon health outcomes and targeting the patients that we have traditionally left behind. That's what we'll be doing over the next decade. Look for this space, because the study itself, having gone through ethics, will now go through governance. We're hoping to enroll the first of our patients, something I'm so much looking forward to, in July or August of this year. Thank you very much.